Welcome to Know Your Food, the podcast where we explore the world of food by speaking with farmers, makers, entrepreneurs, and experts who are reshaping how we think about what we eat. I'm your host, Michael Ray Robinoff, CEO and co-founder of Farm to People, and we're recording these conversations live from our warehouse in Bushwick, Brooklyn. On today's episode, we're excited to welcome investigative journalist Chloe Sorvino. Chloe has spent years exposing the hidden challenges within the food industry. Now reporting on food and agriculture for Forbes and having recently released her first book, Raw Deal, tonight she joins us to shed a light on the chicken industry. We'll explore the differences between commodity chicken sold in grocery stores and the high-quality, ethically sourced options you can find at farmers markets and through Farm to People. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Be sure to subscribe for future episodes. Thank you so much for being here, Chloe. Why don't we start with your personal journey? I'm really interested to know, we've been friends, but I'm really interested to know a little bit more about how you got into journalism and then ultimately what led you also to write this awesome expose of the meat industry, Raw Deal.
Yeah, thank you. So we're here to talk about chicken. And I came to journalism from, I think journalism brings a lot of different people together often. I was always that kid who went to cooking school camp instead of going to like real camp. I was gardening when no one in my family had really been gardening vegetables. My sister and I were, we were gardening nonstop as kids. And so I always loved food and I always wanted to try to really, touch food in different ways growing up. I didn't really know what that looked like in terms of a profession. It was always something in the back of my mind. And when I got to college, I realized that I might be good at this whole journalism thing. I can talk to people, I can hear stories, I can synthesize. It was the first time I really started actually bringing that food reporting in. I was doing a lot of college journalism. And flash forward to working at Forbes. I was on the team that pretty much everyone starts out at Forbes, which is the wealth team, doing the net worth valuations that you see on these major lists. I was doing valuations of everyone in skyscrapers across Manhattan to, oil fields, retail fortunes, and also a lot of food. And it was at that time that I realized Forbes had no one covering food full time, which is so crazy. I think everyone in this room probably can understand why that's nuts. And as I realized that, I realized just how crazy of a time it was to not be covering food in that way, right? Like it was the time when price fixing scandals in the chicken industry were really starting to erupt. It was when JBS was first starting to get a hold in America. My book goes into a lot of the corruption there, and maybe we'll talk about it. Maybe it'll be in the book for you later. And so I started talking with all these billionaires who then, these very few hands that control the vast majority of the meat that everyone has access to across this country. Hearing how glib they were over the years completely stuck with me as I then started heading up food and agriculture coverage for us full-time when it became a full-time beat for us. That's really the lens that I continue to explore. And then that was many years in, and I toured many a slaughterhouse, had thrown out many a ankle boot covered in blood and guts and couldn't keep those on anymore. As the pandemic hit, I started seeing the discourse around meat not being available and how contentious that had become, but also people talking about going vegan and what that could mean environmentally, and then also just what was happening to the workers who were still being forced to work shoulder to shoulder on the line at like line speeds that were ever increasing. I realized that I had this like kind of unique perspective and an ability to really kind of tie the profiteering and the financial underpinnings of what's holding the status quo back from changing. I figured I could tell that story in a way that, it was a time when omnivore's dilemma had been in people's minds. We were all thinking about how we can source better food and get to know where our food comes from. But a decade of that had only led to around 1.5% of total agricultural output being local. And so, nothing was really breaking through. There was a lot of branding, there was a lot of greenwashing, a lot of co-opting. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of explain how we got here and why these few billionaires and corporations that control our meat industry have been holding us back.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to like a number that's even changed in the year since the book came out. The market share of, and again, we're focusing on chicken, but if you look at any other industry, whether it's pork or beef, the numbers often are just as crazy and staggering. But when you wrote the book a year ago, the chicken industry was controlled basically 50% by the top 4 chicken producers. We're 1 year later. This isn't like a long period of time. It's now over 60%. So this consolidation is crazy and it's growing. I think, as you mentioned, talking about these companies, who are these companies? How did they get to the point where they're at? And then what is the danger of so much control being in the hands of so few?
Yeah, I mean, it is really staggering because chicken was actually the least consolidated compared to beef, and pork. Beef is around 80%, pork was around 70%, and that's a lot. Like, taking a step back, like when you think about economics, if the top 4 companies in an industry control more than 20 to 25%, that's a massive amount of consolidation. And so we're talking, quadruple levels from there. And the consolidation in chicken has been really stark, and it's continued. And in a way that, I mentioned the price fixing earlier, that is one of the kind of clear examples of how this consolidation can have negative consequences, not only for the consumers and our prices going up and how that's made it to us, but also for the workers that are getting subjugated in the process. There are other kind of lawsuits I talk about in the book about wage manipulation. Some of the craziest things in the book are about how the chicken industry has been manipulating wages of its workers for more than a decade. And you talk about that, right? I think, those are big words, but to break it down, this is not just, one guy in a top of a meatpacking plant, like deciding you're not getting a raise that year. This was industry-wide talk. One of my favorite anecdotes from that lawsuit and the allegations from it are around how the HR executives would come together at this annual chicken conference every year, and they would decide where they would do some of this collusion. And one of them, they were deciding between like a tiki boat cruise and a dolphin cruise, like when they were in Florida for this conference. And that's where some of this massive collusion in terms of some of the most vulnerable workers in this country, and just deciding they're not be able to get more benefits that year, down to the penny, that sort of thing. And so it's anecdotes like that really kept me going in 2020 when I was writing this. I wrote it, I'm full-time at Forbes, so I wrote this book between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m. every day for a year. And those are the types of anecdotes that really kept me going, at 5 in the a.m., being like, no, I need to get this out to share this with people.
Yeah, I think just zooming in a little bit even more on like monopolies, I think what we could call this is, each of these industries has their own monopoly. And when you look at, when we think about the, tech is, I think, one thing that we're like hearing about a lot. Like, does Facebook or does, TikTok's been in the news a lot, but like, do these companies have too much power? I feel like these companies that control our meat often like skirt really like under the sort of, I guess, like what we're all thinking about on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. Even grocery, I would say, like people focus on that consolidation with Kroger and Albertson and that. Yeah. What would you say are like some of the, and you talked about a few of them, but going even deeper into some of the drawbacks of this sort of consolidation, and how do we also like fix it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think there are
big questions.
So there definitely are ways to fix them. I think the book gets really intense because I think you have to understand why it's there in the first place before you can talk about how to fix it. But there are solutions. I think there is optimism, there is hope, but it's also like a really serious time, and these chicken producers are getting more and more power in a lot of ways. And I didn't really talk about environmentally, right? I mean, environmentally, the consolidation is probably one of the biggest issues, especially going forward. I mean, the whole book is really framed around climate change and how we don't have enough time to waste, and we're losing time every day. I mean, really what we're fighting for is the dignity that I hope we all will still be able to have moving forward, because that's really what's, I think, on the line at this point. But in terms of environment, we're talking about chicken, there's so many different issues, right? You have the water pollution. Then you also have the pollution from the pesticides that are going to be, sprayed on what's being fed to these animals, chicken particularly. I mean, they need feed. There are some operations out there that are doing grass-fed and pasture raised, but at the end of the day, especially chicken, they are all eating feed, and they are all being housed in houses that have energy, like a lot of energy, a lot of heat being used. They can't survive. I mean, these are animals that were created for us to be eaten, really, and commercialized for us to be eaten. They're not really able to like live out in the wild. But so, environmentally, I mean, we could talk a lot there, but a few main key things, like the dead zone in the Gulf, for example, that's kind of a big one in terms of water pollution and soil pollution, and just that runoff from the pesticides and the herbicides that are chemicals that are being used to grow that feed in an ever an ever worsening soil conditions. We also have the aspect of waste. When you talk about consolidation too, we have what's going on right now, which is the avian flu. More than 120 million birds have been killed. That's wild and commercial, but think about the consolidation, right? So one of the reasons actually this avian flu has gotten so bad over the past 3 years is because there's only a handful of these actual plants and slaughterhouses left. And they've all been they used to be, further spread out, different cities, more regional. Now, over the past 4 decades, and even more recently, 2 or 3 decades in chicken, they've been pushed closer and closer where the soy and the corn is grown. So it's easier, less logistics. And now that's in most of the middle of the country, right? In the middle of the Midwest. That's also happens to be exactly where there's all these migratory wild bird flyways. And those birds being around those massive factory farms is part of why this has been spreading so quickly, changing everything from, egg prices to chicken prices. And you're seeing all of that.
In terms of disease spreading, I think also in the book you mentioned that 99% of all chicken genetics in this country come from just 2 companies. And it's basically every chicken that we eat is the Cornish crossbreed, and they're all mostly factory farmed. Because I know that disease spreads faster potentially among the same genetics because they become more susceptible. Would you agree? Is that have to do with this?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. The Cornish cross is used not only in all these factory farms, but also what's used on most of the organic farms. It's used on a lot of the local farms because it's so pervasive now. And when you talk about trying to change and have better breeds and beet breeds that are not just bred for the most fat to be added onto these birds, actually breeding for things like climate resistance, things like heat tolerance, right? Things are getting hotter. Maybe these birds could have feathers that are better at aerating. Maybe these birds could be more athletic. Now we have consolidation, right? We only have a few facilities that are able to kill these birds, and they're all designed for the one size of Cornish cross. And so, if you wanted to change the breed, you also have to change all of the factory, the machinery, and kind of everything along the supply chain with it. But I think it's worth it.
Totally. I mean, I know that this is just a stunning fact, but I know it from talking to farmers myself. The Cornish cross takes about 40 days to reach maturity. A heritage bird takes 80 or 90 days. So when you're thinking about the economics of feeding that bird for double the time, that's a cost. But yeah, I would agree. We're not really thinking about breeding for the health of the bird, the health of the land, or even really the flavor. So I think
flavor's huge.
Flavor's huge. We all care. I think first and foremost, humans care about flavor, and we're losing that by simplifying supply chains and simplifying things. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my book also really talks about Cook's venture, right? A massive implosion. I was very optimistic about what they were doing for a lot of reasons, partially really because it attacked all of these issues. It had its own genetic breed. It was feeding birds milo, an alternative grain. They're even trying to cover crop that grain. And so they were working with independent farmers in the area to do that. And it was really special. They imploded, and it's like a wild tale. But the reason they were trying to do that, I think, is admirable. And when you talk about heirloom, for example, I think we can get into it. I think this audience can be a little in the weeds, no pun intended. Heirloom still is not even all it's cracked up to be. A lot of times those local or smaller, independent organic leaning farms are using Cornish cross still because I learned some really dark things about heirloom chickens. And the older they get, the more mature they get because they take longer. Then those hormones and aggressive tendencies get really prevalent. And so there's a lot of chicken on chicken death and fighting in those farms often. And it's crazy. They're bred in these crazy, horrible environments, and they kind of, follow that. And so that's part of the reason why Cook's Ventures and others have tried to find a breed that is longer than that 45 days, but still less than 80 or 90 that some heirloom people are using. Because, those chickens can get really crazy.
We want a docile chicken.
Yeah, you don't want the chicken, attacking its brothers just because it's stuck in a coop,
And even the Cornish cross, if you visit it, they're still pecking at each other.
Yeah, but the heirloom ones get really, really mean.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It's a good segue into venture capital and the role that it plays in your The book goes into a number of VC-backed companies, Cook's Venture being one of them, Smallhold being another, and then obviously others that are still around, but struggling, I would say, like beyond impossible, like the whole plant-based, sort of, I don't know if it's a fad. Obviously, we need to eat. I think we can all agree we need to eat less of this factory farmed meat. But I think the solution about whether we go to big ag, plant-based solutions, or we go more towards like small regenerative, solutions. I think, how are the demands and expectations of venture capitalists at odds with alternative solutions for sustainable meat production?
Yeah, I mean, this is also part of the reason why I really wanted to write this book, because the consolidation I was talking about in the beginning and how I felt like I could really share there. I also was at the same time hearing from these venture capitalists drooling, calling me up, being like, wow, it's like the early days of the internet in 1999, and we're going to make all this money. And they were like foaming at the bit. And, plant-based, lab-grown, these alternative chicken folks and alternative meat guys and all of it, really. There's been this profiteering on all sides. But that has really, at a certain point, really held us back. What I've learned from the story of Cook's Venture, like the lesson, I think, you can't fast grow a company that's slow growing chicken. You have to do the hard work. You have to look at the long term. There were some key lessons learned. If they hadn't taken certain money, maybe they would still be here. Maybe it would be smaller. And I think Cook's Venture, Smallhold, these companies that have gone bankrupt in these kind of really unfortunately spectacular ways really just show that if you get in bed with the wrong people and your finances aren't what you think they're going to be in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, it could put everything you're trying to do at risk, not just for you, but also for everyone else who's going to try to do that in the future. And, there's so many financiers and bank guy holders and debt holders and lenders who have been really burned by a lot of this. And unfortunately, again, there's not enough time to waste, and we do need a lot of capital. I'm not capital averse. I think, growing it, bootstrapping as much as you can helps protect you in the long run, but I know we also don't have enough time to waste, so we need capital to accelerate, but you really get to a problem sometimes of kind of getting over your skis, and yeah, just hugely disappointing for, I think, those two companies particularly, because they were trying to do so much good and going after the scale and the accessibility that I think we really need more of in this food system. It needs to be like from that democratic lens.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the timelines of like whether it's VC or PE firms are really short time frame windows, 5 to 10 years.
2 to 5 sometimes.
2 to 5 sometimes, yeah. But capital is important. I think Farm to People is a great example of lack of capital.
And we've been
amazing,
around, yes.
Well,
and you're still doing your composting and
still here.
And yeah, no packaging for your deliveries. Like, I think, you're doing really great with what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate it. But going to that point of like, what we're trying to do here is really try to like create a proof of concept for something that hopefully we can see being replicated around the world and help different food systems be healthier and small farms thrive. I guess like going back to that capital, asking for myself, going back to that idea of I guess like where can the capital come from, where the alignment of all of our health and the success of our farmers comes into play. I guess I'm alluding to and getting to like subsidies. I think subsidies are where a lot of these big, like the monopolies are really like getting capital infusion every year into driving the cost of industrial meat down.
Yeah.
VC is just a tiny drop, like, for all we can poo-poo VC, but like they are also like not even a dent in the ecosystem. So like how structurally and politically can we like start to like affect change and get subsidies going towards smaller farmers instead of these like sort of bigger ones?
I mean, we'll see. I'm not holding my breath there on, what's been started today. But, I think the reason why we have not seen any of this taken on in a meaningful way, even though people have been hitting their chest about subsidy reform for years and years, is because, every single senator, every single congressperson has at least one meat maker, one livestock producer in their state, in their region. It is everywhere. And from that perspective, there's always someone who's going to be calling up and trying to sway things. You think about that like on a small level, sure, but also then when some of the biggest companies in the country have access and have just invested millions and millions of dollars in fighting anything remotely that could be good for change, it's hard. I will say, though, part of the reason why this book comes from the business and finance perspective is because I think you have to kind of go around that because I'm not sure subsidy reform is ever going to happen, although it really should, considering just how it keeps the price of corn and soy so cheap, and that's what makes meat so cheap. And yeah, so I think though there are some exciting options when you talk about alternatives to finance. I think debt is a really great option. The book goes into crowdsourcing in terms of like non-equity dilutive loans. So how you can raise from a community and still, have people and stakeholders involved, and yet you're keeping your equity, you're keeping your protection, you're keeping that control. I think in general is super important when it comes to anything financial. The conclusion also talks about and some investment banks that are trying to structure deals differently, particularly around sometimes gross sales instead of profits, or just, things that are kind of better suited for like a long-term family-owned business in the food. Think about like a fishing boat that's owned by a family, or they want to add another fishing boat. There should be capital for businesses like that, and it shouldn't have to come from a VC that's going to then want to sell that family-owned business in 3 to 5 years. So I think it's being really careful about what you are getting into. But there are, I think, more and more firms, I think it's really hard to find them, that are trying to structure deals based on success rather than projections of what they think they can get you for.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, when it comes to financing, you've got two issues as I see it. You've got really like consolidation also in like the banking industry. So like where you used to have like community banks and like a farmer could go to their town's bank and finance a new
credit unions. Yes.
Credit union. Exactly. You're losing that. And then on the VC side, we're so used to like technology and SaaS margins where, you can get Slack going and it's one software, and once you just start adding people to it, the margins are like 90%.
Which is never true.
Yeah, not the way food works. The chicken's a chicken, and you got to process it.
We have one stomach. We can only eat so much. There's only so many chickens.
Exactly. So speaking of so many chickens, I mean, I think going back to like, I guess the sustainability of all of this, Americans eat 9 billion chickens a year, and we only represent a very small fraction of the global population, which is staggering to think about. Why do Americans love chicken so much?
It's been this interesting thing in the past few years. It's grown. I mean, this industry only first started in like the 60s and 70s. So it's really grown exponentially. So in the past like 2 to 3 decades, partially because there's been this, thought about, they have less of a life cycle, right? Like steer will get killed maybe in 2 to 3 years, maybe even less, depending on how much of a factory farm it is. And so you can get so much more out for so much cheaper. They're the cheapest livestock to really produce at this point. And also it's a place where there's been more consolidation, like fewer corporations they have more direct control over the growers. Beef, you still have to independently ranch, at least in the beginning. Chicken has this really kind of exploitative system where the farmers have to kind of buy in with a Tyson or a Sanderson or a Purdue. And because of that, there's been decades of exploitation and this kind of system where it's hard to get out of. And, as more Americans have been turning to chicken and eating more chicken, I mean, again, like 100 years ago, people didn't eat any chicken. I'm Jewish, like Jews have always eaten a little bit of chicken, but really, you think about the mass majority here, it's like it was all beef and lamb. That was really what people were eating. And it's changed so drastically. And that's also because, to bring it back to my book, that's also because these few families have gotten so much control and trying to maintain their control, like the Tyson family being a very prime example of one, even at the detriment to the environment, causing soil erosion where their crops are grown for their chickens, and having horrible human rights violations and child labor violations and price fixing and all the like.
Does it have to do, because I feel like, if you're talking about the last 100 years, you're talking about also like better refrigeration. Sure. Does chicken, chicken does that have anything to do with it or not really? Like when I think about beef and lamb, I think about like slightly longer shelf life.
Yeah. I think it really started with post-war, right? Like when everyone wanted to eat meat all the time, they couldn't make that much beef, right? And so it became that trade-off where at least you could have meat on your table every night, and that was like a wealth indicator, right?
Yeah. And this is a great segue also to like chicken for the masses. We have obviously an obsession with like faster, cheaper, in a lot of areas of our lives. And again, this is a business that I think does a lot really well. I'm going to preface that. You've written about the scale of Costco's rotisserie chicken business. Costco sells about 100 million of those 9 billion birds at an absurdly low price of $4.99. And that, they have been public about that's a loss leader. It gets you in the door. But also their production is damaging to the environment in a lot of different ways. They're subsidizing the cost and making it easier to eat chicken every day. How do you feel? It's a conflicting thing because, I want it, food should be accessible. And Costco does such a great job of being transparent about pricing and not marking things up a ton. But then also, is there a downside to that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this. So I toured the Costco rotisserie chicken slaughterhouse. Their slaughterhouse that they kill, millions of chickens every day, and then what they then use then to get to their rotisseries and deliver it to the world. And when I was also on one of the chicken farms that supplies this slaughterhouse, the farmer gave me a test immediately as I got there, brought out a hot rotisserie chicken from Costco, stuck it on the back of his pickup truck and said, "You're not going to go inside until you eat it." I did, and it was great. I mean, I've eaten rotisserie chicken from Costco a lot over my life, so I just kind of pulled back to that nostalgia. But I mean, it was at this crazy time when avian flu was first starting to get really bad. Nebraska being one of these heat hotspot states of that. We were doing all the avian flu things at the same time as we were eating this chicken. It was kind of like putting on the boots, also having a bite of chicken. It was kind of weird. I really liked writing about this for Forbes because everything I've learned and everything I put into my book is all about how these billionaires and the few corporations that control our meat industry are determining and defining what we have access to in the first place. And that's problematic because they can set the market, they can change demand and upend a market extremely quickly. I mean, I think that's what you have with the power of Costco, especially because they are looking at it from that market loss perspective. They're not trying to make money on it. In some ways, it's interesting because talking about profiteering also being, taking too much money from this being a problem, right? But when you have the no holds barred, not even caring if you're making money on it, then we get into a whole other can of worms. Essentially, they are one of these institutions holding us back from changing this factory farming system because they have this demand and they've built this entire supply chain around it. It's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah. What if they just came out and they were like, now it's $14.99, but it's a regenerative chicken. Whoa. We were kind of had that crazy. Remember when they were like, all the cafeterias are plant-based or whatever? Yeah. And yeah, WeWork's doing great, right?
It's doing great. Yes, exactly.
I don't know if it's tied.
And the Costco co-founder is famous for saying he'd kill the CEO if a hot dog went up above 150. Yeah. So I don't think they're changing their rotisserie chicken price anytime soon.
Yeah, totally.
But also, I will say, with their scale, they're not doing anything to go above and beyond, right? They're not making meaningful change, and they could be because they have almost an opportunity of not caring about the profit, right? They could make a difference and say, we're going to only source Mary's organic chicken and see how that goes. We can do only non-GMO feed, even see how that goes. They're not doing that. They're doing as bottom of the barrel, as commercial as possible, and that's a problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. In your years of reporting, and I think you're one of the people that has gone so much deeper than most other people into the meat industry, particularly chicken. What's one thing that you've learned about this industry in this country that you think most people aren't aware of, but that we should be?
Yeah, okay. So we haven't talked about JBS yet, so maybe I'll talk about that a little bit. JBS is the world's largest meat packer. They're Brazilian. They're trying to go public in the U.S. They've been trying for a few years. This IPO probably will be greenlit in the next few weeks, and we'll see if that happens or not. But JBS and these billionaire Batista brothers actually became billionaires through acquisitions of U.S. assets that were either bankrupt or on sale for really cheap, and they had a lot of these funds, and they were able to invest a lot of it. Turns out a lot of those funds were completely corrupt, part of this massive bribery scheme that involved 3 Brazilian presidents. My book is the most comprehensive telling of this kind of absurd corruption scandal. These billionaires ended up in jail for 6 months each, but at the same time, no one in the U.S. really cares about this has been kind of bigger news in Brazil. These billionaires are still, completely now the second largest in all of the meat in the U.S. They acquired the second largest chicken production company, Pilgrim's Pride. And that deal, Pilgrim's Pride had gone bankrupt. So it was vulnerable, right? And it's kind of where we get into that kind of national security question. So yeah, Pilgrim's Pride was vulnerable. So 2008. And these kind of corrupt funds were used to acquire this company, one of the oldest American meat companies from Texas from 1947. This company was used, and from kind of piecing this back together through my reporting, like the DOJ documents, the SEC documents, and all these other kind of crazy lawsuits, I found out and have shared through the book that, the Pilgrim's Pride bank accounts were essentially used as a slush fund for these billionaire brothers and this company. There were a lot of these kind of crazy bribes that were essentially taken out of Pilgrim's Pride's funds. There are a lot of things still missing. There was a Manhattan apartment that I'm still trying to find the address of. If anyone listening has any leads on that, please let me know. But this is a company, this chicken company that's still, anyone, I'm sure if you've bought chicken once in the past year at a restaurant or a fast food company or a grocery store, maybe 2 or 3 times likely that it's a Pilgrim's Pride chicken. It's that pervasive, it's that at scale. And, there's been a slap on the wrist, but essentially nothing else really has happened. And that's kind of what we're talking about with the chicken industry. There's so much opacity, and that's by design, right? They don't want us to know how this money is being used. They don't want us to know how these farmers are being treated. They don't want us to know how these workers are being treated, because it's like so terrible. And once you know, it's really hard to look away. Yeah.
Wild. Thanks
Yeah.
for sharing. Yeah. Looking towards the future, taking what we've learned over the last 50 years, I would think the direction we're going is not the right one. How do you think, and I guess pulling it a little bit towards farm to people and the fact that we only work with small scale
Yeah.
farmers, how can you help us all understand some of the key differences between small scale organic production and big factory farming, and even big factory organic production?
Yeah, because I think it's a great point, because there's a lot of really large organic at this point that is kind of as controversial or as problematic in some ways as the factory farm stuff. There's so much greenwashing. Sometimes when you're seeing grass-fed, not for chicken as much, but like in beef, for example, sometimes that grass-fed label is really from, cattle at a factory farm that are eating grass pellets, kind of pills, and that's the grass that they're eating. And in chicken, you're getting a Cornish cross like 99% of the time. It has to be like an operation that's really trying to find. There are, but it's rare. In chicken too, you're getting, I'll take a step back. So I think the point of this book is really that we're talking about billionaires and how they're dictating what we have access to. And I think a lot of us have been told over the years that this farm to table movement, that, voting with our dollars is what we can do to fight back. And my kind of thought is a little bit of a turn on that, because when billionaires and a few corporations control what we have access to in the first place, voting with your dollars can really be like a false messiah in a lot of ways. But once we understand that, and we understand how all of that is working, there is a bit of a freedom and an empowerment there, because those dollars do matter if they are going to good meat, institutions, organizations, networks. When I think about how I try to figure it out is, those local farms may not honestly be better for workers. They may not be better for the environment. They may not be better for the animals even. They might be trying, but it's not necessarily better. That's why you have to do the work to understand or support an organization like Farm to People, which is doing that really, really hard work of the research and vetting first. For me, voting with my dollars becomes powerful when I'm thinking about like the community-oriented organizations that I can support, right? Because I think at the end of the day, the billionaires aren't going to be there to save us. It's going to be the communities, the neighborhood networks, the networks of independent local food producers and the regional food producers that are going to still be there for our communities. And like, that's what I want to be putting my limited, financial resources behind. I love buying your chicken. I get my turkey for Thanksgiving from y'all every year. Got some osobuco a few weeks ago, and it was amazing. But otherwise, aside from those like treats, I'm thinking a lot when I'm sourcing meat, basically, around just like those community structures in place and like the financial structures underpinning them. And so, we have a CSA. I'm often buying meat or other protein products through that CSA. There's like a kind of a food hub or a partner network that works, and it is pretty seamless. I think the more that we can invest in institutions that are like supporting those regional infrastructures that are supporting at the end of the day those independent producers, like that's what we need moving forward, and that's what's going to like help us all like face climate crisis and dignity. Yeah.
Totally. I love that. I think just to add to that, like when I think about voting with my food dollar, and you also think about that $4.99 chicken versus a $20 rotisserie chicken, or even a $30. I mean, I've seen them over $30. I think when you start to think, and obviously there's good value, I think value is the important thing, not necessarily like price. I think you can get ripped off at $9.99 compared to $5.99 or $4.99 if it's like a CAFO bird. And you might be getting a great deal at $18.99 if it's a bird that's been raised the right way. I think just going to like personal health, I often come back to like the human feel, like I want to feel good at the end of the day. I want to like enjoy what I'm eating. And I think when you talk to chefs, when you talk to farmers, this is what gives me hope, is even forgetting price for a second, even though I know we all at the end of the day have a limited amount in our bank account, what tastes great often had the best life. Like there's a weird connect for vegetables too. When you think about like how that vegetable was grown, if it was rotated, it wasn't just like grown like carrot field year after year. That carrot's gonna not taste as good as the carrot that was where the celery was the year before, and et cetera. How do we do a better, like, cause I think like greenwashing, marketing, I wanna end on like this sort of note of how we like package everything up. Because this is something we try to do. Like, how do you convince someone that this is the right way to eat when people are like, I can't believe you're selling it for this crazy price? How do we package things better and tell that story better? And then how does the world collectively start to realize value in a different way and disassociating value from cost or price?
Yeah, because I mean, food is both too cheap and too expensive, right? The workforce behind it needs to get paid so much more. At the same time, we all want to pay so much less, right? And meat prices are super interesting too, because not to bring it back to politically, but you know, a sitting president has never been reelected if meat prices are higher than they were in the last cycle. So meat prices are something that really makes people very angry. It really gets at that kind of core of like, I don't know, the best and the worst, mostly the worst, the patriotism. I agree. I think taste and flavor, it's a generally good, especially when it comes to fruit, animals too, because the stress of animals can be huge. When your meat tastes bad, especially if it's grass-fed or pasture-raised or maybe raised without something like the Band-Aids of eating corn, it's probably because it's super stressed out, and maybe because it's just like too cold where it was. You know, I get cold. My meat probably doesn't taste very good, you know? But so, yeah. So, okay, my point being is that we need to all think way differently, right, about what meat looks like on our plates, sure. But I also don't want you all leaving to think that good meat can't exist, because going back to some like the environmental desecration I was talking about earlier, there are some soils around the country and around the world that are so degraded from pollution and soil erosion and these chemicals that have been sprayed on these monocrops for so long. Those soils will never regenerate and produce food unless there are animals and hooves and manure working that soil. Chicken's not really a part of that. Like, chicken doesn't really do that. However, I do think that there are some places where that can work, and ducks are actually better for that.
Chickens can be good following the cow. They're a good follower.
Or for like a mushroom, like a closed loop mushroom situation, like chicken poop is really good for growing mushrooms. You can grow in closed loop systems. I think they can have a future. But yeah, I mean, the way that, you know, you're trying to make 1 million chickens in a tiny little house and do that really quickly, it's never going to be sustainable for us.
Yeah, I mean, chickens like environmentally, like, will tear up a field, you know, so it's like you have to think about vast amounts of space in order for them to actually be, so it's a good point.
I guess the one thing maybe it's not really an answer to your question, but we haven't talked about antibiotics at all. With chicken, I think that's one of the big things to really talk about here. My afterword in the new paperback goes into this a lot, because when I started actually reporting on food at Forbes, it was like the time when Tyson was really proud of itself for saying they're going to stop using antibiotics on their chicken. And because they said they want to like quell this public health crisis, and now only 6 years later or so, they've rolled back on that. And
very quietly.
Extremely quietly, they like snuck it in right before 4th of July, you know, a few years ago when everyone was like already drinking, and you're all 6 beers in, and then that's
antibiotics.
What? And so it's a huge problem, because, you know, the country's biggest chicken producer, and the one that had been supplying the antibiotic-free to, like, you know, Panera, Chick-fil-A, all these like bigger chains, and so it gave the other chains and the restaurants the excuse to say, oh, we can't source it anymore, sorry.
They all rolled it back too, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like the start of this cascade that's happening, and the public health crisis we're going to be facing from that alone is just like so scary. And really, really like underplayed in terms of what people are thinking about.
Yeah, we're all because of this becoming antibiotic resistant.
And yeah, so what I'll say is like supporting these local regional farms that are very strict about being antibiotic free and going above and beyond is in and of itself something major to support when it comes to chicken, even if they aren't actually, just doing pasture, even if they are using some corn or what have you.
This all ties back to the avian flu. The antibiotics are there to keep the chickens alive long enough so that they can grow and be killed. And if they get sick during that they're useless to.
And they just get killed.
And they're killed and not eaten. Yeah. Well.
Should we end on a happy note, maybe?
Yeah. For a happy, fun note, and then we'll open it up to questions. One thing I think we're both fans of what's going on at Blue Hill at Stone Barns.
Yep.
I went a month ago to one of their workshops, and I think what's really interesting, because we think about a lot of things are like dumbed down to like one use and like one use only, and like maximizing it as quickly as possible for like maximum output. I also visited, I'm getting there. I also visited Ronnybrook Farm a little while ago.
I love their yogurt.
Yeah. And what was really interesting to hear about at Ronnybrook is how long they like keep their cows in production, which is a lot more than like most dairies. They don't give them antibiotics. They keep them healthy. If they're sick, they actually care for them. When they retire, they don't kill them right away. They actually keep them alive.
Huge.
All of this is like super rare.
Yeah.
Then, but the dairy industry has been like completely decimated. When you look at like the dairy industry in like 1945 in the US, there was over 600,000 dairy farms. Now there are less than like 20,000.
Yeah.
It's like we've lost like 600,000 dairy farms.
And those like 20,000 are probably like, it's actually probably only...
we haven't lost a cow. There's the same amount of cows.
But it's only probably controlled actually by like way fewer hands too.
You're right, exactly. So that consolidation's wild. The amount of farms that are left are wild. And then dairy farms that want to do it the right way, there's no, like, again, once that cow has done its job producing milk, which again, milk, no small dairy can basically, Ronnybrook's one of the few that can survive off of milk,
right,
because milk is largely subsidized. So all of these, like, that's why you have it's a good thing. You get a lot of amazing artisanal cheese because it has a higher value. But milk, they're not getting any money. So anyway, going back to what's happening at Blue Hill that I thought was amazing is they're taking retired dairy cows, and you can't kill a retired dairy cow right away. That meat is not good. That meat is like Chloe during the winter. It's not good.
Chloe during the winter.
But you wait like 8 months, you put it back at pasture, you allow it to regenerate itself. Yeah. It was delicious. It's amazing. Yeah. And it's a grass-fed cow. That gives me hope, because it also then allows these dairy farmers to have a second income from a cow that already served its first purpose. And I think if we got to help our farmers. That's like my passion.
Absolutely.
Right?
No, and I also have hope from that too. I think there's been too much of that meat that goes into landfill. And that's crazy. We barely talked about waste. That's another huge aspect of this, right?
Totally.
But yeah, I guess just to end before questions, just to underscore what gives me hope, I wrote this book obviously about the finances and consolidation, but really because of this urgency we all need to face, which is the climate crisis. When I think about what we really face, it's not pretty, but what gives me hope is, a producer of Bison, who has a bar called Tonka Bar, the CEO told me something that's like stuck with me, and it kind of shows what I'm trying to say about supporting communities and why it's important, because Bison, they walk into the storm. They all huddle up. Even if a huge, massive storm is in their midst, they bundle up together and they walk through, and they make it out on the other side. And they know that they're going to make it on the other side. And there is like power in that collective. And I think if we can all think like that and think about how we can make it out on the other side together, not as individuals, but through these community supported, organizations, networks, just people, I have hope for that.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Chloe.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Know Your Food, a podcast from farm to people. If today's conversation got you thinking differently about what's on your plate or where it comes from, we'd love if you shared this episode with a friend or left us a review. It helps more people discover the folks reimagining the future of food from the ground up. And if you're in the New York tri-state area, you can shop from our network of small, regenerative, independent farms and makers at farmtopeople.com. And stay in the loop by signing up for our newsletter or joining us on Instagram at farmtopeople. Until next time, eat well and know your food.